challengers. Okay. And we're going to look at the kinds of things a challenger can say. Kinds of things a challenger can say are, well, there are first of all two types of questions, okay? Two questions, right? Types of questions. Okay, two questions. We have thesis question and a pervasion question. Okay, thesis or pervasion. Everyone got it? Thesis or pervasion. Okay, now this is something that will take time to really grasp like what the difference is exactly, but you can get a rough understanding of it right now, good enough to use anyway. So thesis would be something where you take a subject and then you posit something about the subject, right? It's a simple, a statement or question with just two components, okay? Subject and a predicate. Okay, so let's just take something really simple. Take a palm tree. Okay, take a palm tree. And then the phrasing we use for the next component is like this. It follows. Oops. That's not a very pretty eye. Okay. Try again. There we go. Better. It follows that. Oh, that's the wrong button. Okay. It follows that. Okay. So that's the phrasing we use to start off the second term. You could call it the two terms of this thesis, right? X, Y, you could say, right? Take X, it follows that. What? It follows that it's Y. It follows that it is Y. Take a palm tree, it follows that. What? It is, what do you want to say? It is life. How about? Does that work? Does that make sense? Take a palm tree, it follows that it is life. Okay, or how about an organism, maybe? Oops. And that was not a mark I wanted to make. Follows that it is, I'm just changing life because life, you could say, well, it has life, but it isn't life. You could, maybe that's something that we don't want to spend too much time getting into the weeds on what life means. So I'll just say follows that it is an organism. Okay. Well, is that true? What do you guys think? Is a palm tree an organism?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So consensus is yes. Okay, so how do you say yes in the debate language? You say, anyone actually know already?
I accept.
I accept. Excellent. Very good. Okay, so I'll change the color for the defender. Now the defender is answering. Okay, so defender will be green, challenger will be red. I accept. Oh, by the way, how long is this session? 90 minutes or 2 hours?
I think we go until 8:30.
No,
Okay.
it's on the
Oh, is it? Oh,
website for 2 hours, 7 to 9. But whatever is good for you, Losang,
No,
Donyo.
I mean that would give us a lot, that's enough time. That would be good. If yeah, if that's what people are expecting anyway, that's fine for me. I would it takes time, so that's why we're going through it, and it's already like I'm just trying to plan out how much time we have for things. But this is essential anyway. We have to go through the different answers. Okay. Very good. It follows that it is an organism. Okay. Take a palm tree. It follows that it is an organism. I accept. Good. Now, what if we wanted to what if I change the predicate? So I'm just gonna make a little bit of a notation here. So from now on, when I say take a palm tree, I'm just going to write. This is just for the ease of my writing, so I don't have to spend, a minute to write that whole thing. I'm just gonna put an S for subject. But still, we'll say take a palm tree, but I'm just writing an S for subject because that's the subject of the debate, okay? Subject, take a palm tree. The palm tree is the subject. Now, again, the subject doesn't mean the topic can be something broader, and you can take multiple subjects along the course of your debate. But just for this particular statement, that's the subject of this debate and this particular statement or question. Okay, take a palm tree, and then the next part is called the predicate. It's called sometimes different things depending on the particular book or translation that someone's working with. So it can be called, in English, there's a few other words for, I don't remember even right now, but predicate's the most common. Okay, subject is palm tree. Predicate is an organism, right? Follows that it is an organism. So when you see S, we'll say with our mouths, take the subject, take X. When you see P, we'll be reading it as it follows that it is, okay? Okay, so we accepted. Take a palm tree, it follows that it is an organism, accept. Okay, what if I say it follows that it is, let's try this one, a sentient being? Oops, ran out of room. Okay, anyone want to give a try? Well, first, before because you might not know the right words to say, but do you accept this one or not? Take a palm tree, it follows that it is a sentient being. What do you guys think? No, I'm getting a thumbs down. Anyone else?
Don't accept.
Okay, okay, we have one thumbs up. Good. Okay, so then you should be on opposite teams. The thumbs up, and thumbs down, and then and then we can have a real debate. But for now, we'll just pretend we're all in agreement that they don't accept, and then the question becomes, if you don't want to accept this, what do you say as the defender? So go back to green for the defender, and you would say, instead of I accept, you would actually say, well, it's a kind of another question. You say just one word, why? 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 Now, it's funny because when you say why, it is a question, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you expect a reason to be given. It's simply a denial of that thesis. It's a denial of that thesis. Okay? Take a palm tree. It follows that it's a sentient being. Again, so even though the phrasing of this is a declarative statement, you're essentially asking, is a palm tree a sentient being? If you say, I accept, that means yes, it is. If you say why, it means no, it isn't. It means no, it isn't. So when you say why, you're actually accepting already another thesis. What is the thesis that you are accepting when you say why? Anyone want to think about it for a second? Or give a suggestion? So I say take a palm tree. I'm the challenger. I say take a palm tree. It follows that it is a sentient being. Okay. Defenders, you say why? Well, you're rejecting the claim that a palm tree is a sentient being, right? So what are you saying? You're saying no, a palm tree is not a sentient being. Okay. So that means you're accepting implicitly with this why answer another thesis. That thesis is, and again, I'll use the notation of just S and P. Take a palm tree. It follows that it is not a sentient being. Okay? Follows that it is not a sentient being. That's what you've implicitly accepted just by saying why. In other words, it's binary, right? If you don't accept that, right, apples are fruit, then you're accepting they are not fruit. It's just a direct negation. Okay, if you don't accept palm tree as a sentient being, you're accepting it's not a sentient being. Now, because you're a human being and you have free will and you can say whatever you like, I could ask the question again. Now, this is right, continuing with the defender who has said why to the first question, and I could just ask the next question, the negation. Take a palm tree. It follows that it is not a sentient being. And now here's another part of this debate, which I haven't said yet. This is going to be new for most of you, but what you do after you ask your question, right, after the challenger finishes their statement, is we clap. So we say, take a palm tree. It follows that it is not a sentient being. And at the very end of the sentence or question, you clap. That basically marks, marks the end of your statement. So it makes it clear to the defender that, okay, that's my full statement, and now give a response, right? It also is actually there's actually research that's, I'm not sure if it's actively being done, but it's been proposed to be done about just trying to look at the kind of physiology of what happens when you are kind of making these physical motions. There's also we also stomp our foot if you are standing up. If you were actually in real space, you could do that too. And then you clap your hands, and just to see, how that's actually impacting your cognition, the overall kind of mental processes that come along with the debate, because it certainly is, anecdotally or experientially for the people who do it, it's very, what to say, enlivening, right? to kind of constantly be, clapping, and wakes you up, in other words. Okay, so that was an aside, but important to know. So the question. So now that I've asked the opposite, right? It's the direct opposite thesis. Now what do you say? Well, you still have two options, right? If you wanted to be consistent, when you said why, right? You said why, you denied that a palm tree is a sentient being. If you're being consistent, then you'll say a palm tree is, you'll accept that a palm tree is not a sentient being because you just denied that it is, right? If you deny X, it means not X. I mean, denying X is just not X, right? That's the negation of X. But you're still a human being with free will, so you could change your mind in the middle, right? You could say, so you would say, I accept if you want to be consistent. You would say, I accept. But if you don't want to be consistent, you would say,
I do not accept.
Why?
why? You would just say why again, right? So what you did is you said why to the first question, and then you said why again to its direct negation, right? So if you say why again to its direct negation, that means that you're allowed to do that, but it means you've changed your position. So after you change your position, then the challenger will say, nice and loudly with another, not a clap, but slapping the back of your right hand into your left palm, and we say, ha. I don't know if you've ever seen Tibetans debating, but you'll definitely see them going, oh, it's ha, it's ha. That's because someone changed their position. So that's, again, it's sort of this like very confrontational, but not with negative confrontation, just a very direct way of saying, okay, you got it, you changed your position. Is it clear? Right? So does that make sense? You've changed your position. Why? Right? We started with take a palm tree. It follows that it is a sentient being. And this answerer defender said, why? Okay. Now we just gave the direct opposite thesis. And again, the point here is just that, just to confirm, right? Okay, you said why to the first question. So just to make extra clear, just to really be sure, I'm just going to ask the direct negation. Make sure you want to accept it. take the subject of palm tree, it follows it is not a sentient being. Okay? So then if they say why again, that means now you're accepting the negation, right? If you say the palm tree, if you say why to a palm tree is not a sentient being, you're saying it's not a sentient being. Or in other words, right, two negatives cancel out, right? Negative times negative equals positive. So you're saying a palm tree is a sentient being. So you just reversed your original position. So then, okay, now let's move on to the next kind of question. Okay, so far, are there any questions about this, or does anyone want me to repeat anything? You can go ahead and just speak. So far, it's fairly clear. Okay. Good, good, good. Okay, so again, we're just going through the terms right now, the language, right? Okay, so now the next thing we have is called the pervasion question. So this is phrased differently. Again, it's a little challenging to really get the difference between this and a thesis question, but if you really want to learn and use debate for your practice, right, for understanding Dharma or any other subject area, you'll get it. You'll get it over time. Okay, but how is it phrased? So instead of saying take a subject, you just start with the phrase that it follows. It follows that. Okay, it follows that. Okay. And then you would say something like, okay, it's basically an if then statement. So I'll just use X and Y at first. Follows that if it is X, then it's necessarily Y. Okay. Follows that if it is X, then it's necessarily Y. So what if I say something like, I'm just using the same subject from before, follows that if it is a palm tree, then it's necessarily an organism. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Follows that if it is a palm tree, then it's necessarily an organism. Okay? It
Seems like it
means
means
that,
the same thing.
sorry?
It seems like it means the same thing.
Okay, it seems like, right, it seems like it means the same thing, but it means something a little different. So here it means that all palm trees, whatever is a palm tree, also must be an organism. Whatever is a palm tree is an organism. So that actually is saying something different than just saying a palm tree is an organism. Whatever is a palm tree is an organism. Okay? Now, how many of you accept that? Do you think it's true? Whatever is a palm tree. If it is a palm tree, is it necessarily an organism?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, what about what I'm gonna do? I'm just gonna just to show you the form, and maybe it could be convincing to someone. So yeah, it's realistic to use it as a debate subject. So what you do if someone accepts, and again, you would say I accept the same phrasing, right, for the answers as above. So the two answers that you can give to either of these questions as a defender, either a thesis or a pervasion, would be either I accept or Y, right? I accept or Y. Y. Okay. So I accept means yes, Y means no. Okay. I accept. If you accept, then what's the next step? Well, as a challenger, If you want to challenge it, right, you could just agree. You could just say, okay, fine, you're right. I'm not going to push it. Right? I want to go on to another question. But if you want to challenge it, what you then do is essentially you search for a counterexample, right? If you accept this pervasion, it means, again, it's logical entailment, right? If it's X, it's necessarily Y. If it's a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. All palm trees have to be organisms, right? What would the counterexample be? A counterexample of what? Something which, okay, is it clear? A counterexample means you're accepting that everything in the whole universe, which is a palm tree, is also an organism, right? So if we were drawing the Venn diagrams, for instance, right, trying to draw a Venn diagram for this pervasion statement or pervasion question, you could say either pervasion statement for it to be true, then we would have one circle with organisms, right? Okay, we'll just put the organisms, and then we'd have to have palm tree. Where would the palm trees go?
Inside directly on
Inside.
top.
On top.
Well, okay, it could
Solid.
have two options actually, right? One option would be that it overlaps exactly. Okay, so just the same group. Okay, and that would include palm trees. And the other option would be that it's within it as a smaller circle, which actually is how I did draw that, but I meant to try, I was trying to keep it the same. So the other option would be just a smaller circle within, right? So organisms and palm trees, right? Okay. So either way, all palm trees are fitting within the organism circle, right? No, it's not this one, right? Because there are organisms which are not palm trees. So we can find, right, many other organisms which are not palm trees, like humans, etc., right? Humans are in this bigger organism, but not palm tree category, right? Humans, okay. But if so, that's if this is true. Now, if it's not true, the counterexample means that we can find at least one thing in the universe, which is a palm tree, right? But that's not an organism. So here's the organism, here's the palm trees. Okay, that looks like freeze. Okay, palm trees. And so we have, organisms which are palm trees in the middle. Let's say, a coconut palm or whatever, sugar. What do they call it? Yeah, coconut palm. Okay, coconut palm. And then I'm not gonna write it. It's not enough room anyway. But anyway, we have some kind of palm tree in the middle. Oops. And then over here we have things like humans and dogs and cats and cactuses or whatever cacti, whatever you want. Then we'd have to have one thing over here. That's the kind of counterexample, a palm tree which is not an organism. Okay. Can anyone think of something that could be, you could possibly think of an argument to make that would convince someone that it's a palm tree that's not an organism?
The dead palm tree.
What was it?
A dead palm tree.
Dead palm tree. Okay, so what do we write? Well, go back to our challenger color. A dead palm tree. So we just can write the S. Take. Oh, sorry, I don't need to write take. So, but again, we're saying take, and then a dead palm tree. Good. And that's the same example I was thinking of. And then it follows that oops, I'm doing this. I'm writing it follows again when I don't have to. I have the P there already. Okay, sorry. I'll get it. Don't worry. Take a dead palm tree. It follows that it is. Now, what are we saying it is? What do we want to say that it is here? An organism, right?
Okay.
Excuse me, an organism.
We want to say it's an organism, okay? Because that's the thing. We're trying to give a counterexample of something which is a palm tree, but not an organism. Now you might be a little confused, but why are you giving the thesis that it is an organism? Well, this is how debate works in this tradition. It uses what the term in Western logic for it is reductio ad absurdum reasoning, right? In other words, it uses the position of the defender to draw out a logical absurdity or inconsistency, okay? So we're trying to give a consequence of their position, which was this pervasion. If it's a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. If they accepted it, what's the logical absurdity? What's a consequence of that? Consequence of that is that, well, then you're saying all palm trees are organisms. We'll take a dead palm tree. It follows it's an organism. It follows from what? It follows from what you just accepted, right? That's why we use the phrasing it follows. It follows from what the defender has already accepted. Again, being that all palm trees must be organisms. So take the subject, a dead palm tree, it follows it's an organism. Now, let's just say that you don't want to accept that, right? Because, well, dead things aren't organisms. Organisms have to be alive, right? I think that's my understanding of organisms. I don't think a corpse is an organism, right? A human corpse. Okay, so you would say, why? If you're a defender, that's that's already, again, we're assuming like the reason why we thought, and this was a good, my mind went to the same place as I didn't actually see who suggested it, but thank you. My mind went to the same place because why? Well, dead things aren't organisms, but they can be palm trees, a dead palm tree, right? So that's the counterexample. So the defender is saying why they also accept then, in other words, that a dead palm tree is not an organism. So now we're going to actually give a reason as a challenger. So last time, right, when we were up here, we just reversed. I'm not sure which button keeps doing that, but okay. Up here, we started with palm tree. It follows that it is a sentient being, and they said why. The defender said why. The challenger, as challengers, we just reversed it. Take a palm tree, follows it is not a sentient being. So that's one option. You can just reverse give the direct negation of the thesis that you originally started with. So here we have a thesis, take a dead palm tree, it follows it is an organism. Why? So we could just say it follows it is not an organism, right? That would be following the same form as before, reversing it. If we said take a palm tree, it follows it is not an organism. That's again, just to confirm, just to make extra clear with the defender challenger that you're on the same page. But this time we're going to give an actual reason. Okay, so what reason will we give? Again, just using the information we have so far. Just using, in other words, what's already been accepted. Follows that if it is a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. It was accepted. Okay, so what will be the best reason to give right now to prove that a dead palm tree is an organism to this defender? So not in general, but just to this defender based on what they have accepted.
Dead palm tree is not an organism.
No, we're trying to prove that it is an organism. This is the thing we're trying to prove, okay? The thesis is now what we're trying to prove.
Dead palm tree.
This is, again, in relation to what we're not necessarily looking at proving a true statement. We're looking at making the defender see the inconsistency or absurdity of their position. So it's all in relation to what the defenders accepted. We're not necessarily, this is, so again, it's called reductio ad absurdum reasoning, pointing out a consequence of the defender's position. So their position is that if it's a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. But they don't want to accept that a dead palm tree is an organism. So we're going to say, take a dead palm tree. It follows it is an organism because, and I'll just use B for because. Okay, that's an ugly B, but because it is a palm tree. Because it is a palm tree.
You lost me.
Okay, well, that's to be expected. I think when we actually start, I'm giving the overall structure, and then we'll get into our own debate, and then it'll make more sense as you do it. But essentially, what's going on? Can someone try to explain what's happening? If someone who feels like you get it. Let me see if I can expand this so we can have this part on it too at the same time. Okay, so again, the answer actually given here was I accept, right? The Y was just an option, but it wasn't given as the answer. So this is how it played out so far. Okay, challenger starts. It follows that if it is a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. Class. Defender says I accept. So you accept. So what the defender accepted was not this diagram, but the other one where the palm tree is within the organism diagram, circle in the Venn diagram, right? So the challenger is saying, no, there's something over here as well, a palm tree that's not within the organism bucket, right? So what did we give as an example? A counter example. Take a dead palm tree, right? So the defender is saying that all the palm trees are in here. As a challenger, we're going to say, no, there's one over here. But based on their logic, based on the defender's logic, which accepted that whatever is a palm tree is an organism, then as a consequence of that position, this dead palm tree should also be an organism. Why? Because it's a palm tree. Right? The defender's position was that all palm trees are within this circle. So take a palm tree, it follows that it's an organism. Take a dead palm tree, it follows that it's an organism because it is a palm tree. Right? Because, in other words, because it's within the palm tree, again, the palm tree circle from the defender's perspective, right, is within the organism circle. Right? Palm trees has to be within the organism circle, right? So take a dead palm tree, right? It follows that it's within this organism circle because it's within the palm tree circle. That's another way of saying it, right? Okay. Is that making sense? Okay, so now again, the defender is a human being with free will, right? They can answer in the affirmative or they can deny it. Now, what we have here is we had two kinds of questions, right? It's going back to the top. What were they? Two kinds of questions.
The thesis and pervasion.
Excellent. Thesis and pervasion. So the thesis is this subject and predicate only. I added a reason. We added a reason, right? Because it's a palm tree. That makes it now what we call a syllogism, okay? So it's got three parts. Three-part syllogism. This is sort of like the full form of a logical proof, right? Three-part syllogism. It has subject, predicate, and reason. Those are the three parts. Subject, predicate, reason are the three parts. Okay. So when we looked at just the thesis or the pervasion question, the two answers that the defender can give are either I accept or why. Just those two. Now, when we give a reason and it's now become a three-part syllogism, right? Take a dead palm tree, follows that it is an organism because it is a palm tree. Now the answers that the defender will give are different. Not I accept or why, but so again, you could still say I accept. So we'll just keep that in brackets. But if you say I accept, then you're actually doing it's another case where you reverse your position because you just denied it with the why, right? So you don't want to necessarily accept right away. So then you have two other options, which are to say either the reason's not true. Oops, that's a T. Where did that come from? Reason's not true. Or no pervasion. Or you could just say not necessarily. I mean, it's just a difference in terms. Not necessarily is what it means, right? No pervasion means it's not necessarily true. Not necessarily the case. So what does reason not true mean? Let's again just go back and take a look at what do we have here that we're working with for this example. We're working with, take the subject, dead palm tree. Dead palm tree. Predicate, it follows that. Anyone remember? Follows that it is.
It follows.
An organism.
Organism.
What an organism. In this example, we're using organism. Good. It follows that it is an organism. And then the reason, because
It's a palm tree.
it's a palm tree. Okay, so if the reason, right? If the reason is actually a flawless reason, valid, sound reason that can genuinely prove a dead palm tree is an organism, then it has to essentially satisfy two qualities. It has to actually be something that's relevant to the dead palm tree. In other words, a dead palm tree is a palm tree. If it's a true or effective reason that's going to prove this thesis, the dead palm tree has to be a palm tree. It has to apply to the subject. The reason has to apply to the subject. And there has to be this pervasion or entailment between the reason and the predicate. Okay, so the subject has to be the reason, and there has to be a pervasion that if it's the reason, it's necessarily the predicate. That's the only way this will actually prove that a dead palm tree is an organism. So if you don't want to accept, so does anyone here think that a dead palm tree is not a palm tree?
No, I accept that.
You accept, okay, well, if you wanted to go that route, again, you have you have the freedom, right? You can say anything, even if it seems absurd, and this will happen constantly when you're debating something that just seems so utterly absurd to you, the other person will genuinely accept and believe. Okay? So if someone really wanted to accept that, they would say the reason's not true. This is the response. If they want to say that this subject is not the reason, they would say reason's not true. Okay? If you wanted to say that I accept that the dead palm tree is a palm tree, but I don't accept that if it's a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism. Right? If you want to deny this part, you would say no pervasion. You would say no pervasion. So which one do you want to say? Do you want to just accept it? And then when you accept it, basically the reason worked. The reason worked to prove to you, the defender, that a dead palm tree is an organism. Right? If you don't want to accept it and you want to keep your position above, which when I say your position, it just means that this was the thesis asked. Take a dead palm tree. It follows it's an organism. The defenders, we said, as a defender, we said, why? That means we're accepting it's not an organism. So the challenger gives a reason, because it's a palm tree. Right? So if we want to just say, yeah, you're right, that's a convincing reason. Now I'll accept that a dead palm tree is an organism. You can just say, I accept. If you do that, well, then again, you get a nice sa because you reversed your position. If you want to stay consistent and deny that a dead palm tree is an organism, you have to choose one of these two. The reasons not true or no pervasion. Reasons not true or no pervasion. Which do you think, which is, someone just suggest one and then suggest what we should do next. What you think we should do next. Anyone want to give a response? Well, Bob, you said that you think a dead palm tree is a palm tree, so you wouldn't say reasons not true. So what if you say no pervasion? Would that make sense?
Yeah.
You would say no pervasion. So then what happens? What do you think happens next?
I have to figure out what an organism is.
Cool. So you jumped ahead just one step. Very good. Very, very good. That was the excellent response. So the first step there was one little step I would add in there. And this is again, just for the sake of clarity, meaning to make sure that you're on the same page with each other, the defender and the challenger. So as a challenger, I would literally just do another one of these things where I just repeat the opposite of the thing I said before. But this time, not the thesis, but the opposite of the pervasion, right? The negation, I should say, to be clearer, the negation of the pervasion. Why? Because you're saying no pervasion to a pervasion that you already accepted. That was how we started this whole thing. That's why that subject was posited to begin with, because up here, right, you said when the challenger asked, it follows that if it is a palm tree, it's necessarily an organism, right? Defender said, I accept. That's why we chose the counterexample, a dead palm tree. So now if you say no pervasion, you've just reversed your position again, this time the pervasion. So I'll just to make sure you really want to go in that direction, we'll say it follows that. Okay, I'll just make it an F just for brevity of writing, but we'll be saying it follows that. Okay. It follows that if it is, right, a palm tree, and then we have to put a negation in somewhere. Where does it go? Follows that if it is a palm tree, then it's not necessarily an organism. Okay? That's what was implied by saying no pervasion, right? You negated the pervasion. So now you will have to say, to stay consistent, you would say, I accept. Now we can go on to Bob's next point. Okay. So, and we can, again, just for clarity, we can kind of stay the subject and predicate again. So just to keep it, really clear what we're doing, where we're going. So I'll just go back to it. Subject, palm tree. Dead palm tree. Take a dead palm tree. follows that, predicate follows that it is not an organism. Okay, so we asked this question because we know that they don't want to accept it. It follows it is not an organism. So now we're giving the, instead of last time we gave the reason, now we're just giving the negation of the first thesis that was there. And then to stay consistent, right? The defender or Bob is going to say, I accept, right? I accept. Now we have one more move, and this is the last move I'll show you before we start doing it ourselves or as a in the group form, like I said. Okay, that's the next move you can do is now as the challenger, you ask for a reason. You ask for a reason, right? Take a palm tree, it follows it's not an organism, I accept. So now you say, posit a reason. Why is it not an organism? Posit a reason. Why is it not an organism? And this another way you can do it. Actually, you could even just directly say, posit a definition of organism. You could say, you could do either of those. You could just say, right, if you want to just go straight for a definition. So this is one of the big things that we have to do in debate is really learn how to get clear about the definitions of things. And that's one of the main ways that we increase our clarity about any given topic, right? And you have to test the definitions through the same kind of process we just went through by checking, well, is there really a pervasion? Can you find a counterexample? Posit a reason or posit a definition of, right, organism. Good. Okay, so who wants to try it? So what if the challenger says posit a reason? What do you say? It's not an organism because, so in the reason you would say, well, there's so many options you have, but if you wanted to use the definition of organism in your reason, you would deny, you would say because it's not that definition, right? So let's just say the definition of organism is, does anyone actually have one that that you want to suggest? Make something. Try to think of something. So, a collection of tissues that reproduces, and why not? Okay, a collection of tissues that reproduces. Okay. If you want to deposit that as your definition of organism, for the reason you would say it's not an organism because it is not a definition of tissues that reproduces, right? That would be your reason. Does that make sense as a definition?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you posit that as your definition of organism, right? Collection of tissues that reproduces, then you could just repeat the same process. And that is how the debate goes. Then you would just state it as a pervasion. It follows that if it is a collection of tissues that reproduces, then it's necessarily an organism. And you would have to accept because that was the definition you gave as a defender. So now you would again try to find a counterexample, right? So it goes along this way. Or if you posit, and I'll just say one more thing, if you make a pervasion that the defender doesn't accept right from the beginning, then you can ask the defender to give the counterexample. So it doesn't have to come from the challenger, it can come from the defender. Okay. In other words, let's just say it follows that if it is, well, this one's very easy. Okay, it follows. So again, I'll just use F for the shorthand for writing. It follows that if it is, okay, if it is an organism, we'll just use the same realm of examples, then it's necessarily a plant. then it's necessarily a plant. So who accepts that? Anybody?
No.
What answer to give then? You don't accept?
Why?
Why? So now if you say why, then as a challenger, I can say posit a counterexample. Posit a counterexample, meaning something which is an organism but not a plant. So then what do you say to give your counterexample? You say take, and then whatever you want to posit. Take
An animal.
an animal. Good. Take an animal. Very good. And then and that would still allow, and I might say, well, that's so silly. Why would you even bother asking such a silly question? Because that sets you up to now ask for the definition of organism, right? So now you can say, take an animal, follows that it is an organism. And then they accept it as the defender, and you can say, okay, posit a reason. It's an organism because of what reason, right? And then that allows the debate to still go into a new and interesting direction. Okay, so let's start as with each other. Okay, so that was already, that was a whole hour, was it? Okay, well, we have an hour still left then. Any questions at this point? Any questions or anything that you want to feel like it wasn't clear or addressed enough? Let's try it together. Okay, so I'm gonna close this for now, or can I just maybe I can make it smaller, because I think it'll be helpful to still have it up so we can write things. Okay, there we go, just so I can see everyone's faces. Okay, so how many people? 1, 2, 3. Oh, it's the same set, right? 8 people. So I'll just go based on who's on my screen that I can see. So Venerable Chimpel, and then sorry, it's Richard, right? Richard, okay. Graham and Bill. Okay. Those 4 of you. Okay, now we have and then 4 left. Those 4 of you will be the challengers. To start, we could switch after, right? Challengers. And then Bob, Steve, Benabotendro, and I don't know who are you in the last the Fail and
Phelan, yeah.
Phelan is your name. Oh, good. Sorry. Okay, Phelan. Perfect. So Phelan, you 4 will be on one team as defenders. Okay, as defenders. So challengers. So first thing you can do is think of a topic you can that you want to ask something about, right? So first, I'll just maybe just to kind of direct it a little bit. Do you want to do something that's specifically Dharma oriented, or do you want to kind of do something more general, just a kind of common sense everyday topic, just to learn the mechanics? Might be nice to go into a Dharma question, right? Yeah, let's do a Dharma question. Okay, so for Dharma questions, of course, that's what we debate about here. So there are countless. There's so many. Okay, so can someone think of something that you'd like to ask about? And again, it's the challenging thing that you really do need some practice to learn how to do here is just to figure out how to phrase maybe a very big question that has many different aspects to it in this kind of bite-sized, bit-sized language, kind of just to put it into bits. And then you have to ask sort of one bit at a time, right? So that is a challenge. But can someone think of an example? If not, I can give one, or I can suggest one. Okay, let me see here. How about so we're familiar with the phrasing of like the Four Noble Truths, or we're familiar with the Four Noble Truths, right? So we have the true suffering, right? True suffering, okay? And then we have true suffering and we have suffering. Okay? So you hear sometimes people saying, actually, I hear very often people saying who are, maybe somewhat familiar with Buddhism, but not full, but not deeply familiar, or anyway, who have some familiarity with the Four Noble Truths, people say things like, oh, life is suffering. That's the Buddhist perspective or Buddhist teaching. Okay, well, let's find out. It follows that, so we can start with the pervasion. So I would word it like this, and then I'll just let you guys take over, okay? It follows that if it is true suffering, as in the Four Noble Truths, the first one, right? True suffering, then it's necessarily suffering. Okay. So someone on the defender challenger side, someone, volunteered to ask it. And then the defenders, you decide how you want to answer it. And remember, we do the clapping. And just to start the debate, we always start by just clapping and saying the seed syllable of Manjushu, which helps to invoke Manjushu's wisdom and to remind us that the purpose of this is to generate wisdom and to remove ignorance, right? So it even has a compassionate motivation there because you want to remove ignorance for both people, you and the defender, right? So we start by saying "Dee," like that. So whoever wants to ask the question, start with D. You don't have to, you can say it how you want. You can just say D, it's fine. But say D and then ask the question.
So this is us making the statement, right? Or is asking.
Right. It's a statement or, I mean, it's called a question because it has this two, this binary yes or no response, I accept or why, but it is making the statement. Yeah. The phrasing itself is a declarative statement. Yes.
Right, then, okay. It follows that if it is true suffering, then it is necessarily suffering.
Now, I know the challenge here is that the defenders, like everyone, we're not in like separate, we're not separated. So the challengers will hear whatever you're saying, but it's fine. It'll help everyone learn anyway. So, but feel free to deliberate to see where you want to go with it, as the defenders.
We can do like breakout rooms or whatever. I've never done that in Zoom before.
I know, but the issue is then you'd have to break out just to like come up with what answer you want to give and come back, and then it would just be too. It'll take too long, basically. Yeah. Okay, defenders, do you have any thoughts? Do you want to accept or reject it? You have two options, I accept or why.
Could you reject, not because you necessarily reject, but because you further want to understand the statement?
Yes, right. So you don't have to have 100% certainty about the answer you're giving as a defender, right? You can totally just use it as an experiment to say, well, where would it go if I reject it? Exactly, right. So that's why it's very playful, actually. Yeah. So you want to just do, right? If you don't have yourself a good idea, you can just reject it and see what happens. But then if the challengers then ask you to give a counter example, you'll have to say something. You'll have to think of something, right? Okay, you want to go with it, Felon?
Yeah, I would go with why.
Why? Okay, there you go. Challengers, you got a why. What next?
Then do the challengers have to make the next statement?
Then the challengers make the next statement, but it could be a couple things. I think the clearest thing to do is just repeat the same pervasion with the negation, just to make it really clear. That's what the defender really wants to accept. So how would you do that? You just say the same thing, but But instead of the positive, the way it's phrased, you would just negate it. Where do you put the negation? You say the same thing, but you add a negation somewhere. So someone give it a try from the challenger team.
If it's true suffering, then it's not suffering. Is that
Then it's not necessarily
not
suffering.
necessarily suffering?
The necessarily is important because there's a difference between not necessarily suffering and necessarily not suffering.
Hmm.
Okay. Don't get confused, but just as a note. So it follows that if it's true suffering, then it's not necessarily suffering, right? So I should be writing the necessarily, but I'll just write it again. Okay, so that was there. So now, of course, what are the defenders going to say? Helen, do you want to say your response?
To be honest, I guess I don't necessarily understand, and maybe that's just part of the issue of why I don't know how to respond to it, is like, what's the definition of true suffering? But then I would assume that if I keep saying why and push further into the debate, then the challenger would have to define that reason, correct?
Well, either the challenger or the defender. So you might have to think of come up with a definition, but the challenger will then point out flaws in it, if there are any, to help you clarify why it's not a good definition. In other words, over the course of the debate, you'll get clearer about the definition of it. Yeah.
Oh.
So, but here you would say not why, because you said why to the direct opposite, right? You
Yeah.
said why here. So here you would say
Um,
to this one here,
I accept.
you accept, right? So in other words, you're saying that there exists some example of a true suffering that's not in the suffering circle, right? Okay. So there exists some true suffering that is not suffering. So now what does the challenger want to do? So the defender is saying there exists some kind of true suffering which is not suffering. So what are you going to do, challengers? Any suggestion? I mean, what do you want? You want to find out what that is, right?
Yeah, right. You want to say what is it? Then what is it?
Yeah, posit a counterexample. Exactly. Posit the counterexample. That's how we would say it. Okay, so that's the answer, or that's the next thing that the challengers say. Posit the counterexample. So defenders, now you have a counterexample to give. You have to think of something. And again, you could just be experimenting, just try something. Like, well, I don't know really, but let me see. This might work, just like we did with a dead palm tree. I didn't really know a dead palm tree is an organism or not, or what, but we just tried it, right?
And so the statement that then the defenders would be making would be defending the previous statement that the challenger said, that if true suffering, then not necessarily suffering. So
it's defending that by giving an actual concrete example. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So you would just say take, and then say the example that you want to use. So any ideas? Take. So it's a subject. So take.
Illusory suffering.
Illusory
Mistaken suffering. I don't know.
Okay.
Some other kind of suffering.
Illusory suffering. Now again, true suffering here meaning like the first of the four truths, right?
Oh.
Okay, take illusory suffering. That's the example. Now, what is the challengers, what are you going to do? So you want to keep that same subject, right? So you would just now make a thesis statement about it. take this subject, and then it follows that. And what do you want to say? Someone give it a try.
So illusory suffering, if you have illusory suffering, then it's not necessarily suffering. That is,
Well, here we want to just do a thesis now. Okay, so we established that this is a counterexample. So essentially, the next step is to check it, check that it actually works as a counterexample, which means you have to now take it as a subject and make a thesis statement with it. Take illusory suffering. It follows that. What does it have to be? If they're correct, meaning that if it's a genuine counterexample, it has to be this, it has to be X, and not Y. It has to be true suffering, which is not suffering. That's what it should be. So this is going to lead us, like Fedlin was saying, to be able to define true suffering or to define suffering. But we're just going step by step. So someone try, right? You have two options for your provision. Sorry, for your predicate here. Sorry, not a provision, it's a thesis. For your predicate here, you have two options, right? Because they're giving a counterexample that is this one, check, but is not suffering, right? So you can use one of those two as your provision, as your predicate. Sorry, the P is there. It's making me think provision. It's predicate. So take illusory suffering. It follows that. What would you do? Someone from the defender side can try it too. If you just to try and phrase it, just so you're saying, getting used to saying it. We'll just try give any predicate and we'll see if it makes sense. Again, we're making a thesis statement, which is just a subject and a predicate. The subject is illusory suffering. So what should just give any suggestion for a predicate and I'll help try to point us in the right direction.
Take the subject illusory suffering. It is necessarily true suffering.
It follows that it's true suffering.
Oh,
Yeah, we don't use the phrasing necessarily in the thesis, only the provisions. Okay,
Right,
so
okay.
necessarily is only for the provisions. So it follows that it is true suffering. Thank you, Venerable. Follows that it is true suffering. Okay. Now, why is that a reasonable thing to ask at this stage in the game? Oh, I should actually be using red here because that's not the defender's. Okay, so the defenders gave the subject illusory suffering. So now as the question, as the challengers, we're taking that same subject, take illusory suffering. Okay, it follows that it is true suffering. Why is that reasonable? Anyone have a thought? Where did we go? Let's just trace back, right? We started with the pervasion. It follows that if it's true suffering, then it's necessarily suffering. The pervasion was denied with Y, so we just gave the direct negation of it, just to confirm. It follows that if it's true suffering, then it's not necessarily suffering. They accepted now, okay? So they said I accept, so then we said posit the counterexample. They said take the subject illusory suffering. What is that a counterexample of? Right? If we're drawing our circles, it means they're saying that illusory suffering is something which, right, is in the true suffering category, but is not in the suffering category. Now, We can just assume there's overlap here. We haven't confirmed that yet, but we can just assume there's overlap. But either way, suffering. We're saying that illusory suffering, right, is somewhere over here. True suffering that is not suffering. So that's why this is a reasonable question, because that's what they just gave the example, the counterexample of illusory suffering. So they're saying it's in this true suffering circle. So you can say, take the subject, illusory suffering, it follows that it's true suffering. Does that make sense? Okay, and so what are the defenders going to do? That was your example. So you better if you want to be consistent, you're gonna say
I
either
accept.
I accept, right? Either I accept or why. If you want to be consistent, you would say I accept. Now there are cases, again, it's real life, you're real humans, your thoughts change every moment. You could literally, say the example out of your mouth, and then the very next moment go, "Oh no, that was silly. That's not true at all. That's a wrong, right?" And you might reverse it in real life. It happens, but let's just pretend that that's we're sticking to our convictions, and you wanna stay consistent. Okay, so take illusory suffering. It follows as true suffering. I accept it. Now, challengers, what's our next step? Again, what did we do about the dead palm tree when the defender accepted that it wasn't an organism? What was our next move? Was to
Posit a
ask for
reason.
something, a reason. Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Posit a reason. So that's our very next statement. So they accepted. So now posit a reason, right? So this is where the defenders have some more freedom, right? Generally, you have just those few answers. I accept why the reason is not true or no pervasion, but when the challenger is asking you to give a reason, then you can say whatever you like. Okay? So posit a reason. A reason for what? A reason for why illusory suffering is true suffering. Any suggestions from the defenders? Or the other option is we can, does anyone want to try a definition of true suffering? Or at least something of it doesn't have to necessarily be a definition, just something that there's some logical entailment, some necessity that if it is this thing, it's necessarily true suffering.
Could you define suffering, or do you just have to find true suffering? Because that was the
Well, that's okay. Let's go back then. Okay, so challengers, we're gonna make a little change to our question. Instead of asking the thesis, take illusory suffering, it follows that it's true suffering, we're gonna say it follows that it's not suffering. Okay, because that's the same. That's part of what they already accepted with their example, right? They accepted that it is true suffering, but not suffering. So we could just ask the second branch. We could do either for our thesis question. We could ask it follows that it is suffering, or we could ask it follows it is not. Sorry, it follows it is true suffering, or it follows it is not suffering. So let's change it to make it, just because that seems to be a little easier to think of maybe a reason for. So then they accept again. Okay, we're just so we'll just go through it. Right? Take illusory suffering. It follows that it is not suffering. Defenders accept or reject. You want to say I accept or why? Defenders, are you gonna accept it?
Well, we didn't accept the previous one. So if we didn't accept this one, then
No.
we'd be going
This
backwards.
is suffering, though. This is just not suffering, though.
Oh, okay, okay.
Because again, what did you give the example for? Something which is true suffering, but is not suffering, right? That's the counterexample. So you want to accept that it, right? If you say the thesis statement, take illusory suffering, it follows that it is true suffering. You should accept it to being consistent, to be, consistent with your own example. Take the subject, the next one would be take the subject illusory suffering. It follows that it is not suffering. Again, you should accept that, right?
Okay.
So you want to accept. So now again, as challengers, we can just say, as Bill pointed out, positive reason. So this will lead you fail into what you want to do. You want to give a reason for why it is not suffering. So that means you can define suffering essentially, but just say it's not that, right? Why is illusory suffering not suffering? Because it's not, and then give your definition of suffering.
Mm.
Okay, any thoughts? So why is illusory suffering not suffering? I mean, Venerable Tendro, what was your example? Do you have some? Do you have some reason? you were, you were the clever one to come up with the counterexample.
Well, doesn't suffering involve feelings?
Yes, good. Okay. So where do you want to go
So,
with that?
so,
Yeah.
uh, if it's, you know, illusory suffering would not. No, I can't. I'm sorry. I'm off on that one. Illusory
Well, no,
suffering wouldn't be
yeah,
necessarily feeling. I mean, you
good.
could, if yeah, you
So if
can't feel.
you could try and streamline that into just a just a few word answer. Illusory suffering is not suffering because it is not a feeling. How about that? Okay.
No, I got two negatives. Go ahead.
Well, one negative's in the predicate and one's in the reason.
Okay.
Illusory suffering is not suffering because it is not feeling.
Feeling.
Okay. Not. I mean, that's what I'm hearing is what you're trying to say. That's what I heard from it. So
Got it.
because, right, we're giving a reason because it is not feeling. And again, illusory suffering is the subject, right? So that means now challengers, what did they just say? What did the defenders just say? They just said something we can turn into another thesis statement, right? Just to clarify, right? What would the thesis statement be? Take,
You have suffering or take suffering, there must be a feeling associated with it. There must have a feeling.
that's okay. So that would be the pervasion that comes out of it. Very good. So the pervasion that comes out of it would be, it follows that if it is suffering, then it necessarily is a feeling. Right. Very good. Very good. So that's one option. We could ask that, right? And frankly, you phrased it perfectly because because they use the negative, not feeling, it actually, you already took out the two negatives, which is easier. But just to say it, the literal, just to keep the exact wording they use, we would say it follows that if it is not feeling, it's necessarily not suffering, but you just reversed it, taking out the negatives. It follows if it is suffering, it necessarily is feeling. So that's one thing we can do, sure, or one thing that challengers can do, right? It follows that if suffering, then necessarily feeling. I'll just give you the other option, and then you can decide which you want to do for your actual question. Okay. The other option would be to make a thesis statement. That's the pervasion statement. Thesis would be take the same subject. Illusory suffering here was the same subject that we had that they had given earlier. That's what we're still focused on. Sorry, not subject of suffering. Illusory suffering. It follows that, and then we just use their reason, right? It follows that it is not feeling. Okay. Oops. Does that make sense why we would ask that? Because that was the reason they gave. So we want to confirm. Are you sure? I mean, to be a valid reason, right? To be a good reason, it had to have two qualities. So let's just write it again. In this case, for the reason to work, what does it have to do? Well, let's just put our three here: subject, predicate, reason, illusory suffering, not suffering, because not feeling. So for the reason to work, there has to be both. So that's why we got both of these possible next steps as challengers, right? So Graham gave the next step that the challengers can make with the pervasion. Why? Because if this reason is true, if it's valid, in other words, there has to be this pervasion, that whatever is not a feeling is necessarily not suffering, which when you take out the negatives means whatever is suffering is necessarily feeling. Now, Graham sort of just did that automatically, which is pretty incredible. That's actually not so easy to do, but you got the point. Very good. Okay. So I hope that's clear to everyone why that is, right? But anyway, we're not going to spend too much time. It was the right the right move to make. The other move we can make, as the challengers can make, is to check, well, does the reason apply to the subject? In other words, is illusory suffering not feeling? Is illusory suffering not feeling? Right? If that's not correct, then the reason was not a good reason. Right? So that's one thing we could check. So that's why we have these two options. Okay, does that make sense? So these are the two options for the next move. Okay, option one is, sorry, is this thesis. Option two is this pervasion. Okay.
Excuse
Those
me,
are the next two options for the challenger. Sorry?
can you
Go
make the ink a little darker? It's like your virtual pen is running out. It's so very faint.
Oh, it's because I zoomed out, I think. Is it better? Or maybe it just needs a thicker line. Yeah. Probably just needs a thicker stroke or something.
Okay. This is great.
Let's see. Is that darker? Yeah, that's darker, right?
Much better.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so challengers, you want to take one of these two options? Whichever one. See where it goes. Anyone chime in, feel free. Anyone from the challenger. Okay. Yeah, Chupa.
So if it is illusory suffering, then it is not a feeling.
Then it is necessarily a feeling. Oh no, the first one you're wanting. Okay, illusory. So take illusory suffering, right? So that's the wording here. Take illusory suffering. This subject, when we just have the s, we're going to say it as take when we actually speak it. Okay, so take illusory suffering.
Right.
Follows that
Follows
it is not a feeling. Okay, so this is the one that the challengers chose. This is the thesis statement. The subject is illusory suffering. The predicate is not a feeling. Okay, so defenders, again, this was the reason you just gave. So if you want to stay consistent, what do you have to say?
I accept.
I accept. Okay. Defenders accepted. Let's see. Accepted. Now the challenger. What's your next step? Now the challenger can do one of two things, right? What do you think the two options are now? So we have this thesis statement that they've accepted, right? They've accepted that illusory suffering is not a feeling.
Posit another reason.
Good. So the challengers have option one would be to posit a reason. Now, what should that reason be proving? Oh, no, are you saying to ask the defenders to posit a reason or to posit a reason?
Posit a reason.
As the challenger.
Right.
So what should the reason be proving? What is the reason that the challenger gives? What would it do? What would it prove? Now we would make, in other words, we would make a three-part syllogism with the subject, predicate, and reason, right? Take X, right? Again, just use the variables. Take X, it follows that it's Y, because that's a B, because it is Z, right? So what do we have as our subject?
Like illusory suffering
Illusory suffering.
is suffering because it's a feeling.
But that's not what the thesis was, right? The thesis, we already have the thesis. We're just adding a reason. The thesis is that it's not a feeling, right?
Oh, right.
Okay, good. Yeah, we got the right idea. Take illusory suffering, follows that is not a feeling, because, and now the challengers, you have to give some reason. So the reason the challengers would give is going to, oh no, I'm sorry. We want to prove that it is, erase that. Okay. The defenders accepted that it's not a feeling. So we want to prove that it is a feeling if we're challenging that. Take illusory suffering. It follows that it is a feeling. So if we wanted to ask the defenders for a reason, those are the two options, right? One is to give our own reason to say that illusory suffering is a feeling. In other words, we have to negate whatever the defender is saying, right? We have to contradict what they're saying. That's option one, right? Option one, give a reason that negates the defender's position. Okay, the defender's position, again, was when they accepted this thesis. They accepted that illusory suffering is not a feeling. So we want to say, take illusory suffering. It follows that it is a feeling, right? Is a feeling. Because, and now we could give a reason, or the option two, just to say it, and then I will make sure we give a reason, but just to say what it is, option two would be just to say to the defender, posit a reason. Okay, so if we take option two, then we're going to force the defender or ask the defender to give a reason for why illusory suffering is not a feeling. That was the thesis they accepted. In this option, option one, the challengers have to give a reason to prove that illusory suffering is actually a feeling, right? We have to contradict the defender. Again, not just for the sake of being contrarian, but for the sake of actually clarifying, well, what is illusory suffering? What is the feeling? What is suffering? Right? Clarifying each of these concepts individually. I mean, they're more than concepts. They're, our lives, right? They're samsara. They're who we are. Okay, so Let's try this one, okay? Take illusory. Is that clear why you would be giving a reason to prove that it is a feeling because we were negating. Is that clear? Okay. So take illusory suffering. It follows it is a feeling because now challengers, what's the reason? Why is illusory suffering a feeling?
Because it is suffering?
Because it is suffering. Good. Because it is suffering. Okay, now the funny thing is, this again goes back to the first question that was asked at the very outset, right? The pervasion. It follows that if it is true suffering, then it's necessarily suffering, right? So they gave illusory suffering as the example, which is not suffering, but we could still do it. Why? We could still use this reason. Why? Because the defender, first of all, they might change their mind, right? Second of all, it gives us a chance to now go and prove. If they deny that illusory suffering is suffering, we can now give a reason to prove that it is suffering. Right? So this again, it just allows us to move deeper and deeper into each of these, these notions. What does suffering mean? Okay. So defenders, you got your reason. You have now three parts: subject, predicate, reason. After the reason, you can say either what. If you want to accept, you would say I accept. That means you reversed your initial position though. If you want to be consistent, you say what? Two options. Either reason not true, right? Or no pervasion. Okay. Which of those two do you want to go with, defenders? So if you say reason not true, what does it mean? First, let's go back. If you say reason not true, it means what?
That B is incorrect. But if
Well,
you
it means that illusory suffering is not suffering, right?
Yeah.
That B is not true of the subject here. Exactly. It means that illusory suffering is not suffering. If you say no pervasion, it would mean what?
Not all suffering is a feeling.
Excellent. Not all suffering is a feeling, or if it is suffering, it is not necessarily a feeling. So which one do you want to try? Reason not true or no pervasion. Which way do you want to go?
I'm curious, if you say reason not true, could you like just rebuttal it by just saying, oh, like you could just say, oh well, illusory suffering is what was it? Illusory suffering is a feeling because it's not suffering. Like, can you just reverse the B? Or would that be like I don't know, that seems funny. Then you just get into like a loophole essentially.
Right. Well, you wanna make sure that you don't, right. And what you're saying is like a circle, like a circular reasoning. You want to make sure you don't do that, just because that's not going to go anywhere, right? So that's you have to make the conscious decision to not do, like, you could do that. Yes, you could just have circular reasoning, but that means that you're going to sit there for 10 minutes just in a circle. That is nonsense, not reasonable to do. So you just have to be, have the integrity to not do that, to find another reason. So then that means that you deny it. So now we have to give another reason. So take same subject, right? Illusory suffering. We're going to keep the same subject, but now the predicate is going to change, right? It follows that it is suffering. So what did the reason not true mean? What did they deny? They denied that illusory suffering is suffering. That's what the reason not true meant, right? Again, we went with option one, not option two. So option one was that the challengers gave, right, our own reason. Take illusory suffering, it follows that it is a feeling because it is a suffering. Defenders said reason not true. Okay? That means they said that illusory suffering is not suffering. So now we're going to prove that it is. Take illusory suffering. Follows that it is suffering because why? Probably makes more sense to actually use an R for this one because it means a reason, right? Even though we're saying because. Either way, that's the reason though. Illusory suffering. Take illusory suffering. It follows it is suffering because
It's a feeling.
it's a feeling. Well, that's gonna kind of be this circular
That gives
thing.
us the circular recursive argument, right? But
well,
would you
that would
say
be.
something? Would you say something like because it leads to, and then suffering is anything that leads to samsara, right? Or something like
Good.
that.
Try it out because it leads to samsara. Excellent. Excellent. That way we'll check the defenders will let you know if that was a good reason or not. But if that was a completely valid and perfect reason, the defenders will check it. But
But just
it's
one
good that
question.
it's not
Yeah,
going into circular.
just one question. So that we don't go into circular arguments, do we just try anything and then let
Yeah.
the defender and
Try
the challenger
anything, but
just
again,
tries anything and sees what the response is, and then you go from there, right?
yeah, you want to try
Yeah.
anything, but you want to also be informed by your education. We've all been studying Dharma and have various resources, right, about that we can check, or learning the Lam Rim and learning the Bodhicharyavatara and these things and see, like, or these just the intro classes, whatever classes you've gone to, and try to remember, like, well, what did I learn about suffering? What did I learn about feeling? What did I learn about true suffering? Try to be make an informed answer, but yes, you want to just try something that makes sense to you and see if it works out. So
So
that
it
was a
might be
great.
might be simpler. It leads to or it keeps you in or something like that. It's just very simple.
Sure. Leads to
Yeah.
samsara,
Okay.
keeps you samsara. Sure, you
Okay.
can say that.
Yeah.
Okay, so now as the defenders, again, you have two answers you can give. Either to stay consistent, right? If you ever, as a defender, if you ever say I accept to a reason, it means that you are going back on your previous position, right? Because the only reason a challenger will give a reason, the only time when a challenger will give a reason is if you've already denied the thesis as a defender. So if you then accept, that means you're saying, oh, okay, yeah, I accept the thesis, you've reversed your position. So you generally, if you want to be consistent, you will want to stay with either no pervasion or reason not true. So which one? Again, we have these two options, right? Which one are you going to go with? So no pervasion would mean what? If it leads to samsara, it's not necessarily suffering. Reason not true would mean that illusory suffering does not lead to samsara. Does that make sense? Why, right? The meaning of those two responses, right? So reason not true would mean this is not true. No pervasion would mean that there's no entailment between these two. There can be something that leads to samsara, which is not suffering. What do you think? Do you think there's anything that leads to samsara that's not suffering? What about
Some kind of non-virtuous act
Hmm.
a non-virtuous
in and of
act?
itself. If you kill somebody.
Yeah, or what about even a virtuous karma?
Well, yeah, that's true too.
But you could say that a virtue
Contaminated virtuous karma.
suffering.
Contaminated virtuous karma. So what is a contaminated karma, though? Any karma that's done with the motivation of, that has somewhere in the motivation, self-grasping, right?
Self-grasping, yeah.
Which is, pretty much a majority, a vast majority for anyone who hasn't already realized selflessness, right? So again, But this is the thing, like you don't want to just give any stock answer. You want to get to it through the debate. That's the whole point. So you really understand. But I mean, you could start with, yeah, why don't we start with the example you gave? So you're going to say reason not true. Oh, sorry, no, you're going to say no pervasion first. Okay, so we'll just skip ahead because there's not time. So, yeah, defenders say no pervasion. Challengers say give a counterexample. Okay, we did those steps, and then the counterexample is the act of killing itself, right? Okay, so take the act of killing. Okay, so they're taking the act of killing as the example, which is something that leads to samsara but is not suffering. Okay, so now challengers, again, you have, right, two different thesis statements you can make now. You could either say take the act of killing follows that, right? I mean, you can challenge two different things, right? You could challenge their position that it leads to samsara, or you can challenge the position that it's not suffering. So what do you want to say? Take this. Well, let's just talk about it, right? What do you guys think? Is the act of killing something that leads to samsara?
Yes.
Yeah.
The act of killing leads to samsara. Okay, that seems like everyone agrees. Okay, and is it suffering?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is suffering. Remember, this is supposed to be something which leads to samsara but is not suffering. So if you think it is suffering, then you can, again, get the defenders to contradict themselves. So we can challenge that branch, right? So how would we say it? Take the subject act of killing, and we're just going to jump ahead because of time, but you could go kind of put a few more steps in between. We're just going to jump right ahead and say take act of killing. It follows that it is suffering. Is suffering. Okay. Is that making sense? Because the reason that we gave above had to have two true things. It had to be applying to the subject. In other words, illusory suffering does lead to samsara. And it had to have this pervasion or entailment. Whatever leads to samsara is necessarily suffering, right? So let's see. So then they denied it, and then they denied the pervasion, right? And then they gave the act of killing as an example. So now with the act of killing as an example, it has to be what? It has to be something that does lead to samsara, but is not suffering. So we're going to say it is suffering to refute them. Okay. Take the act of killing, it follows it is suffering because, anyone got a reason? Now at this point, anyone can jump in. Challenger, defender, we're all together. We'll all switch hats every time just to get some more ideas flowing. The act of killing is suffering. Who said it? When I asked if it is, people said yes. What were you thinking?
Because it creates
Yeah, leads to samsara. Sort of circular again, but
Well, try something else.
But could you use something to do with virtue or merit or something like that?
Yeah, could you say because it creates karma?
Because it creates
Because it creates
negative karma that
Yeah.
ripens the suffering in the future or something.
Because it creates negative karma that ripens the suffering. Okay. Because it creates negative karma. Okay. So then we could say what do we want to say as the defenders? You want to accept, or you want to just accept and agree that it is suffering, or do you want to again try no pervasion or
So
or not true.
once you accept, like the debate's done.
Well, no, then you could still ask, like again, the defender can say, okay, well, you accept that it's suffering. It is suffering because of what reason? So the defenders can now ask you for another reason. Sorry, the challengers can now ask you for another reason, right? I mean, it's totally open, right? How much you want to stay focused on one particular question, but you can just keep asking for more reasons or giving your own reasons or turning it into a pervasion statement. That's why, it's a fairly limited set of options for this, the kinds of statements, but it can go on and on and on, right? You know, you just kind of think about the next thing that you want to ask about. So you could just ask something instead, like you could change this into a pervasion, which again is a different kind of question, even though it's a little bit hard to understand why. And I'll just close with that, just so um because time is running out, but just so you can see how it works. So you could, as the challenger, just say, you know what, instead of giving a reason, I'm just gonna change the question to a pervasion question, just again to ask more about it. So you would say, it follows that if it is an act of killing, then it necessarily creates negative karma. Okay. Or is necessarily suffering. I mean, you could ask either of those, right? Okay, now if they accept, then they accept that everything that's an act of killing creates negative karma. There is no example, a counter example, which is act of killing, which does not create negative karma. Okay, so then if we want to challenge, we get again, the challengers now come up with a counter example. So what kind of counter example could we come up with? An act of killing that does not create negative karma.
When you kill someone for their own good or something like that. I don't know.
Well, sure. Well, the Bodhisattva, right? The Buddha in his former life as a Bodhisattva, when he was, right, a ship captain who killed are you familiar with the story where the
Yeah.
Buddha's earlier life as a Bodhisattva killed a merchant on a ship because he knew that they were planning to kill all the other people on the ship and steal their stuff, right? So he was planning to kill like 499 people. So the ship captain, who was the Bodhisattva who became the Buddha later, he killed this one merchant, right? Okay, so I would take that. So take the subject, the Bodhisattva who killed the merchant on the ship, right? It follows that it creates negative karma. What do you think? And if you say why, it follows it creates negative karma because it's an act of killing, right? Because again, that's the pervasion. If they accepted the pervasion, then that's always going to work as a reason, right? In other words, unless you want to contradict something that you said before. Take the subject, the Bodhisattva who killed the ship merchant. It follows that act of killing follows that it creates negative karma. What do you guys think?
Yes, because then it said that even though he did that, he still spent like a fraction of an amount of time in hell because of that action.
Okay, very good. Yes, that actually is how it's told. So that would make sense. Now, what about an act of a Buddha killing, though, or an arhat killing? Is there any? Take the subject, an arhat, right? An arhat stepping on an ant and killing it. Follows that it creates negative karma. Without knowing that they're, without seeing the ant there. It follows that it creates negative karma because it's an act of killing. What do you guys think? So this is the end of the time, but that's exactly, you could see, we're just starting now, just starting to see how this can really go into, a real analysis of something like karma and, non-virtue, virtue, when something becomes negative karma, right? So I hope that at least I'm seeing this question is starting to get interesting, right? You can tell by the silence. Everyone's like, I don't know.
It's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, good place to. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I enjoyed that very much, and I hope it sounds like you guys were getting the gist of everything. So very good.
Okay, so we'll do our closing prayers now. Thank you.
Yeah.
May the precious and supreme bodhicitta rise in those whom it has not yet arisen, and where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but ever increase more and more. In this land, surrounded by mountains of snow, you are the source of all benefit and joy. All powerful Chenrezig and Zingyatso, please remain until samsara ends. So that your holy deeds may bless the nature of fortunate disciples, and that the Lord of 10 powers teachings and realizations spread, supreme lamp who shows the path to the intelligent, may you live long and your virtuous deeds triumph. The sole medicine that dispels all the illnesses of grasping at extremes, the profound meaning of dependent origination that is free from extremes, and the intention of the supreme Arya Nagarjuna and his spiritual successors, I dedicate this virtue as a cause for properly understanding these. By this virtue, may all beings perfect the accumulations of merit and wisdom and achieve the two holy bodies that arise from merit and wisdom. Okay. Thank you so much, Venerable Donyo.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Venerable.
Jay.
That's amazing. You were up at 5:30 in the morning teaching us debate when, they were. It shows how steeped you are in debate and how brilliant you are. I just wanted to mention really quickly that there's going to be a debate school at Sarah J that Venerable Dunya is going to be leading from February 6th to March 9th. So it's a full month. And so if that's something that you're interested in, then please get in contact with Losang Donyo. Venerable Donyo, do you want to put your contact information maybe in the chat? There may be people who
Yeah.
are
Well, and I'll put the website of that programs just so you can see see more about it there. But
Yeah.
the link is not clickable for some reason. But anyway, and then my email. But yeah, it's a whole month. But the thing is, there's a special kind of a permit that you need to come to the Tibetan settlement where the monastery is. So if you are interested, you really have to sign up like this week because it's just not going to be enough time to get that permit. It could take, over a month sometimes. So so do if you're interested, and it's free of cost. There's no cost to attend. Obviously, just your travel, but the month, yeah, it's sponsored by the monastery and everything. So, and it will be me plus a nun from Italy, from Lama Tsongkhapa Institute and the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. She's going to be co-teaching it with me, and then another nun from Jamyang, Jamyang Chiling Nunnery in Dharamsala. So yeah, it'll be good.
The way you're talking, it sounds like we cannot attend online. We would have to actually come there.
Yes, it is actually a full month and it's very intensive. So it sort of doesn't make sense to do it online just because it's it's all day every day anyway. So like if you could manage to do that from your home, it's likely you could manage to come here. I mean, I could imagine situations where that's not true, but it would be, involve so much extra technical setup and everything to make it possible to do online. So we haven't started that. It's possible at a future time we might. There's a lot of interest for that. But yes, it would be staying here in Sarah J Monastery.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank
Good luck
you.
with your studies.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. Bye.